Anthony, many thanks for agreeing to do this. You may be the only living philosopher we're reading whom the students have actually heard of. But to be on the safe side, please tell us who you are.
Okay, I'm Anthony Appiah. I teach philosophy at NYU in the philosophy department in the law school. And I've worked in quite a lot of areas of philosophy. But most recently, I've spent a lot of time thinking about sort of social philosophy, philosophy of race, gender, nationality, religion, that kind of thing, and what that means for ethics.
Yes, and you also have a day job as the New York Times ethicist.
I do, which is very surprising. When I was asked to do it, I wasn't sure it was a good idea because I thought the sort of problems that people have in practical life might not be much helped by the sorts of things I was likely to think. But it turns out that the tools of philosophical ethics are actually what they're promised to be. They're actually useful for thinking about how to live your life. And it turns out that if you read people's letters, you can see that very often they're confused about something, which if you could clarify it for them, they would actually be able to answer the problem themselves. So it turns out to be a more useful thing to as it were, to the world than I expected.
Yeah. So it's not so much that you're bringing to bear some theory, as it might be Kantian deontology, but rather using various distinctions that philosophers make.
Yes, I mean, sometimes I wouldn't ever say Kantian deontology in the column, but I mean, I might use an idea of Kant's, but I don't think you need to give people all the background theory. But it's useful to distinguish between caring about the consequences of what you're doing, whether you have duties and rights, whether you have relationships that generate special obligations, and those are all things philosophers think about all the time. And and I think recognizing that just sort of putting things into boxes for people and saying, look, these are the considerations that you have mentioned, and this is how they work, and they work differently. If you're just fussed about consequences, you won't worry about duties and special obligations. Again, you don't say it like that, but and usually I think you should worry about duties and special obligations as well as consequences. So I say what I think the duties, consequences, and obligations are.
Right.
And a lot of it, again, as you would expect when people have an ethical question, a certain amount of it is just going to find out what the facts are about something, which they could have done for themselves usually, because it doesn't take me very long usually to find out. But a lot of questions about something like COVID, you just want to be as up to date as you can on what the scientists are currently saying about it.
Yes. Okay, so we are reading The Uncompleted Argument, which is about the evolution of Du Bois's views on race. And I thought I'd start with a non-philosophical question, since this is quite a fascinating area for you personally, I think. So Du Bois isn't just an interesting intellectual figure, there's also a connection with your father. So could you tell us a bit about that?
So my father spent the last part of the Second World War as a student in London from Ghana. And he got very much involved in the politics of independence. And so he knew an awful lot of people in London who were involved with that. And he'd ended up being president of something called the West African Students' Union. Well, one of the things that was mobilizing, particularly the African independence movement, he knew people from South Asia and other places as well, was Pan-Africanism. And the first Pan-African Congress had been held in 1900 in London, and Du Bois was the main figure. And in 1945, at the end of the war, there was a gathering of Pan-Africanists in Manchester, and my father went to that, as did everybody in his circle, which included, Kenyatta, Nkrumah, all the independence generation leaders who were in Britain at the time, Kamuzu Banda, who was to go on to be president of Malawi. But Du Bois came to it. And so my father met Du Bois in 1945 at the fifth Pan-African Congress, which happens, actually 75 years ago, last week or the week before. And obviously he'd heard of him already, obviously, since he was interested in Pan-Africanism. And the man who had, one of the big sort of intellectual interlocutors of Du Bois was a man called George Padmore, who was a Jamaican communist. He lived for a while in Moscow and in Vienna, and then was kicked out by the Nazis from Germany and came to Britain. And he wrote a very famous book called Pan-Africanism or Communism, but was a leading Pan-Africanist. And he was my parents' best man at their wedding. So, so it wasn't just a kind of set of intellectual connections. These people were very close to one another. And as you know, Du Bois himself, though he was an American in 1945, was a Ghanaian when he died, because he moved to Ghana when Nkrumah, who was the other person that my father met in London, who went on to be the president of Ghana, having been prime minister before that, Nkrumah invited him there. And he was so mad at the civil rights situation in the United States that he renounced his American citizenship when he was told that he could have Ghanaian citizenship. And Du Bois has the distinction of being the person, I think, who had the first state funeral in Ghana after independence.
Right.
Because he was a big national figure.
And Du Bois joined the Communist Party later in his life.
Yes, when he had moved very late in life. His, I don't think he was ever, well, it depends what you mean by communist. I mean, there are so many ways of thinking about what communism is. Any sort of serious philosophical treatment of the matter would require lots of distinctions. But he joined the Communist Party. He did not join the Communist Party in the 1950s when he could have. And in fact, he was accused of being a communist, and he was tried for being an unregistered foreign agent of the Soviets, and not convicted. A New York jury declined to convict him. So he was always, I would say, in the socialist tradition. That's not surprising. He was a graduate student in Germany in the 1890s, and people like one of his teachers, Gustav Schmoller, was one of the so-called Katheder Sozialisten, the lectern socialists, and a member, and one of the founding members of actually basically the social democratic movement in Germany. So he was very influenced by the German left, and so he was always serious. I think the reason he wasn't a communist before was that he thought that you needed to think about race and class both, and that you couldn't just reduce questions about racism to questions about class. His analysis of, say, the way in which race relations developed in the American South after abolition, after the Civil War, focused in a book called Black Reconstruction, focused very much on the question of how a deal was basically cut between the owners of everything, land and capital, and the white working class. And he saw racisms as having had the function there of essentially dividing the working class. So that's a pretty communist sort of analysis.
Right.
But he wasn't a member of the Communist Party until late in life.
Okay, well, we should probably get on to the crucial metaphysical question that we're going to be concerned with in the class. But before I do that, did Du Bois make a big impression on your father? I mean, if you look at pictures of Du Bois, he seems like an imposing figure.
I guess he did. You know, it's funny. So I grew up in this Pan-Africanist household, but by the time I was sort of, by the age at from which I have memories, which is much later than most people, because I was very, very ill as a child, and so I don't remember most of my childhood, but I have memories from the early 60s. I was born in 54. A variety of people came through the house from the African diaspora. So Richard Wright, the African-American novelist, came through, and he wrote a book called Black Power about Nkrumah as a result of his visit to Ghana. And C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian Marxist intellectual, wonderful writer and thinker. There's actually a mention of me in his diary notes in his archive of talking to my parents, and this cute boy comes in, little boy comes in, and since I don't have any brothers, it must have been me. So anyway, so we lived, but by that point, Du Bois was under the protection of Nkrumah, and my father was in the opposition. in a party that opposed Nkrumah. And at the time, actually, my father was imprisoned by Nkrumah and was in prison at the moment that Du Bois died. So he wouldn't have been hanging out with him at that point, not because Du Bois was in favor of locking up people, but because he was ensconced in the close circle of a president that my father disapproved of. I mean, politically, they'd been very close friends. If Padmore hadn't been the best man at my parents' wedding, probably Nkrumah would have been, but he'd just been appointed what was called leader of government business. So he was busy in the Gold Coast colony, basically running the colony. Mm. So they had been very close friends. And even though my father was locked up by him, he wouldn't, his discussion of Nkrumah in his autobiography is remarkably cool and balanced, I would say. I tried to persuade him to say more about Nkrumah. And this was very characteristic of my father. What he said when I said that was, de mortuis nil nisi bonum, only speak well of the dead. So and I should say, I mean, not only did he speak well of the dead, but he was on the delegation that went to fetch Nkrumah's body after he died and bring him back to Ghana for burial. So he participated in the funeral rites. So it's a very odd relationship. And so anyway, that explains why Du Bois wasn't sort of, also he was 90 something and he wasn't getting out so much at that point.